Winter came to a forgotten mountain town, and with it arrived a man who no longer believed in peace and a wounded German shepherd who refused to leave his side. They were not looking for trouble. They were only searching for quiet. But some towns survive on fear, and when fear was finally challenged, everything began to change. A single act of cruelty against a loyal dog would awaken something powerful in a man who had buried his past for too long. What followed would expose secrets, heal a broken town, and remind everyone that sometimes the strongest victory is choosing not to become the enemy. This is the story of how one man, one dog, and one small town learned to stand again. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from today and leave your location in the comments below. You are not here by accident. This story might be meant for you. Snow arrived in White Hollow the way old memories do, quietly at first, then all at once, until the narrow mountain roads, the sagging wooden porches, and the crooked storefront signs were wrapped in a single pale silence. The town lay tucked between dark pine ridges and frozen streams, a place where winter stayed longer than it was welcome, and where people had learned to speak more with their eyes than their mouths. It was into this hushed world that Ethan Cross arrived just before dusk, his patrol truck creeping down Main Street as snow began to fall again, thick, slow flakes settling on the hood like unfinished sentences. Ethan was 41, tall and broad-shouldered, but built with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to conserve strength rather than display it. His dark hair was trimmed short, the way it had been since academy days, and faint lines framed his eyes, not from age, but from years of scanning rooms and measuring threats before others even noticed the room existed. His face carried the stillness of a man who had buried much and spoke little of it, and his gaze held the reserved patience of someone who had once lost everything important and refused to lose anything else again. On the passenger seat beside him lay Shadow, a 7-year-old German shepherd, black and tan with a coat thickened by winter and scarred by time. Shadow's muzzle was already dusted with gray, his ears no longer snapping fully upright at every sound, and his hind leg bore the memory of an old injury that stiffened in the cold. Yet his amber eyes remained sharp and steady, following Ethan's movements with unwavering loyalty, as if guarding not a road, but a life. Shadow had served with Ethan in search and rescue after Ethan's wife, Laura, died in a highway accident 3 winters earlier, a loss that had unstitched the future Ethan thought he knew and left him carrying a grief he never learned to name out loud. Shadow had been placed with him after the department noticed how the dog refused to leave Ethan's side during recovery, as though the animal had recognized a wounded soul in need of guarding. The truck stopped in front of the White Hollow police station, a 2-story brick building whose windows glowed faintly against the growing dusk. Ethan stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against the frost, and the wind slid along his coat like a whisper of warning. Inside, the station smelled of old coffee and worn paper. The first person he met was Deputy Harold Finch, a man in his early 50s with thinning sandy hair, a slight stoop in his shoulders, and the nervous politeness of someone who had learned how to stay invisible in his own life. Harold was not tall, not particularly strong, but his eyes were kind and tired, and when he spoke, it was with the careful softness of a man who had learned that words could cost him more than silence. "You must be Cross," Harold said, extending a hand. "I'm Finch. Welcome to White Hollow." Ethan shook his hand. "Temporary assignment," Ethan replied. "Just here to help until the spring thaw." Harold gave a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Spring comes late around here." From the back office emerged Sheriff Nolan Pierce, a man nearing 60, broad through the chest and heavy in the shoulders. His gray mustache thick and stubborn, his face weathered by years of compromise. Nolan's uniform jacket hung open, revealing the slow fatigue of someone who had once believed in rules more than outcomes. He studied Ethan for a moment before nodding. "You're early," Nolan said. "Storm's coming." Ethan glanced toward the window where the snow thickened. "So am I." Nolan gestured him inside. "We'll get you settled. Town's quiet, mostly." The word mostly hovered in the room like something unfinished. Shadow remained close to Ethan's leg, tail low but calm, eyes alert to the unfamiliar space. Nolan noticed him and softened a fraction. "Good dog," he said, though he spoke as if the compliment might cost him something later. Paperwork followed. Maps of the town were spread on the desk, their edges curling with age. Nolan explained the layout. The scattered farms beyond the ridge, the abandoned freight yard at the edge of the rail line. He did not mention the name Ethan would soon hear everywhere. When Ethan finished signing the last form, Nolan's voice dropped slightly. "You'll be staying at the old Cross cabin," he said. "Your parents' place. Still standing last I checked." Ethan nodded. The cabin was the only reason he'd accepted the assignment. He needed something familiar in a place he intended to forget himself. As Ethan turned to leave, Harold hesitated, then spoke quietly. "If you need anything, officer, best ask me early in the day." Ethan met his eyes. "Why?" Harold glanced toward the closed office door, then away. "Some things move through this town after dark." The wind cut colder as Ethan drove toward the cabin outside town. The road narrowed. Snow building along the edges, the trees bending beneath their white weight. The cabin appeared like a memory waiting to be reopened, its roof sagging slightly, porch rail crooked, but the structure stubbornly upright. Ethan carried his bag inside, the wood floors creaking in protest, the heater rattling awake after too long a sleep. Shadow limped behind him, refusing help, pride intact. Later, as dusk thickened, Ethan drove back into town for supplies. He stopped at Claire Donovan's diner, a low building with fogged windows and the warm scent of coffee spilling into the street. Inside, the air was heavy with quiet conversations that stopped when Ethan entered. Claire Donovan stood behind the counter, a woman of about 45, tall and slender, with sun-worn skin, blonde hair streaked with early gray and pulled into a loose knot. Her movements deliberate and unhurried. Her eyes were soft but cautious, the look of someone who had learned endurance the hard way after her husband's death in a mining collapse years before, an event that had shaped her into a woman who listened more than she spoke and carried grief like a second spine. "Evening," she said, offering a small smile. "You're new." "Just passing through," Ethan replied. She slid him a menu. "That's what they all say." He ordered coffee and soup. Shadow lay at his feet, head resting on his paws. Claire brought the food, pausing to glance at Shadow's stiff leg. "He's old," she said gently. "So am I," Ethan replied. Her smile lingered. As he ate, Ethan noticed the way people watched the door, the way their laughter arrived late and left early. Outside, the snow thickened, and White Hollow held its breath. Ethan finished his meal, paid, and stepped back into the winter with Shadow close behind. From the far end of the street, a truck idled longer than necessary before pulling away. Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes, but said nothing. The town was not dangerous yet, but it was afraid, and fear, he knew, was never empty. Morning arrived over White Hollow without color. Snow fell in slow, patient layers, muffling the town into something that felt less like sleep and more like waiting. The mountains stood rigid in the distance, their ridgelines half erased by cloud and frost, while the wind traced cold fingers along empty streets. Ethan Cross woke in the cabin before dawn, the heater clicking unevenly, the old floorboards whispering beneath his boots as he crossed the room. He had slept little. The cabin still smelled faintly of pine and dust and the memory of his parents' lives, and the walls carried a silence so thick it pressed against his ribs. Shadow lifted his head from the blanket near the door, amber eyes finding Ethan immediately. The German shepherd's body unfolded slowly, stiffness lingering in the injured hind leg. But he stood without complaint. Age had thinned his muzzle with gray, dulled the shine of his coat, yet his presence remained solid, grounded, like something the winter itself would not dare move. Ethan knelt and checked Shadow's leg the way he did every morning, careful, methodical, fingers moving with the same discipline he once used on wounded teammates. The joint was swollen from the cold, the muscle tight beneath his hand. "Easy, old friend," Ethan murmured. Shadow's ears tilted back, not in pain, but in apology, as if he believed the injury was his fault for slowing them both. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the dog's and exhaled. "We'll get through today," he said, though he wasn't certain what that meant yet. White Hollow moved slowly as the day unfolded. Ethan drove into town to begin his shift at the station. Shadow in the passenger seat, watching the road as if memorizing every drift of snow, every shadow between the trees. At the station, Deputy Harold Finch was already there, hunched over a cup of coffee, his pale sweater stretched thin across his narrow shoulders. Harold looked up when Ethan entered, his smile quick but uncertain. "Morning," he said. "Storm's supposed to worsen by nightfall." Ethan nodded, setting his gloves on the desk. Sheriff Nolan Pierce emerged from his office a moment later, coat unbuttoned, gray mustache heavy with condensation. Nolan's eyes were lined deeper today, the look of a man who had not slept. "Cross," he said. "We'll have you riding with Finch today. Get a feel for the town." They drove the back roads, the snow thickening around the tires. Harold spoke little, answering questions with half-phrases, pointing out abandoned farms, the collapsed freight yard beyond the ridge, the quarry road that no one used anymore. Each place carried a story he did not tell. When they passed the row of closed storefronts near Main Street, Harold slowed. "This used to be busier," he said. "Before." He did not say before what. They stopped at the general store for supplies. Inside, the owner, Margaret Hensley, a woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair, pulled into a bun, and hands that shook faintly from years of arthritis, rang up their items with polite efficiency. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan, then away. When Ethan thanked her, she nodded but did not speak. Outside, Harold exhaled slowly. "People don't like new faces," he offered. Ethan knew that was not the truth, not the whole one. By late afternoon, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain. Ethan finished his shift and drove back to the cabin with Shadow, stopping once at the edge of town for fuel. A pickup truck idled across the lot longer than necessary, its engine rumbling low, the driver's face hidden behind fogged glass. Ethan did not look at it. Neither did Shadow, but both of them felt the weight of attention. Dusk came early. The wind rose, pushing snow sideways across the road, turning the mountains into dark, distant ghosts. Ethan decided to eat in town rather than at the cabin, if only to observe more of White Hollow in its natural state. He parked outside Claire Donovan's diner, just as the windows began to glow amber against the blue of the storm. Inside, warmth wrapped around him. The low murmur of voices drifted through the room, cut with the scent of coffee and soup. Claire stood behind the counter, tall and slender, her sun-worn skin softened by the glow of hanging lights, blonde hair streaked with gray, pulled back in a loose knot that fell over one shoulder. She moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned patience through loss, her husband's death, years earlier, having stripped hurry from her life. When she saw Ethan, her mouth curved into a small, careful smile. "Evening," she said. "Storm's getting mean." "Winter's making a point," Ethan replied. She handed him a menu he didn't need. "Sit wherever you like." Shadow followed Ethan to a booth near the window and settled at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes scanning the room. Ethan ordered soup and bread. Around him, the conversations were thin and restrained, people speaking as if afraid of their own voices. A pair of men at the corner table fell silent when he glanced their way. A woman with a child pulled the boy closer to her side. The door opened suddenly, letting in a blast of cold and noise. Marcus Hale entered. Marcus was thick through the chest and neck, built more for intimidation than endurance, his dark beard trimmed into something deliberate, his hair slicked back as though confidence itself were a garment he wore. He was in his early 40s, tall, heavy in his stride, and the way he moved announced ownership. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they swept the room with practiced authority. Behind him came three men, each different in shape but similar in purpose, one tall and narrow with a shaved head and restless eyes, one broad and red-faced with hands scarred by work he no longer did, and a third younger than the rest, jittery, uncertain, trying to imitate the posture of men he feared. Marcus's gaze found Ethan instantly. "Well now," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily over the room. "Looks like the town finally got itself a hero." Laughter followed from his men, sharp and empty. The diner grew still. Claire's shoulders tightened slightly as she set down a coffee pot. Ethan did not respond. He continued eating, back straight, movements unhurried. Shadow's ears lifted, his body tensing subtly, a low awareness rippling beneath his fur. Marcus approached the booth, his boots heavy on the floor. "New face," Marcus said. "Didn't know White Hollow was hiring outsiders." "Temporary assignment," Ethan replied without looking up. Marcus chuckled. "Everything's temporary. Some of us just last longer." His gaze dropped to Shadow. "Nice dog." Shadow lifted his head, eyes steady, ears forward. One of Marcus's men kicked at the leg of a nearby chair, the sound echoing too loud in the small room. "Dogs don't belong inside," he said. Claire took a step forward. "He's not bothering anyone." Marcus raised a hand slightly, as if humoring a child. "Just conversation." Then, without warning, he nudged Shadow's injured hind leg with the toe of his boot. Not hard, just enough. Shadow let out a sharp, broken sound and shifted his weight, pain flashing through his body, but he did not bare his teeth. He did not move away from Ethan. The room froze. Ethan's hand tightened beneath the table. Every instinct screamed to act. The memory of training, of violence, of endings he had sworn never to choose again surged up inside him. He forced himself to breathe. Slowly, he stood. He placed money on the table. "We're leaving." Marcus's smile widened. "That's probably wise." Ethan met his gaze then, eyes steady, unreadable. "Touch him again," Ethan said quietly, "and this conversation won't end the same way." Marcus laughed, a sound without humor. "In this town," he replied, "I decide how things end." Ethan did not answer. He turned and walked out with Shadow at his side. Outside, the wind cut across the street, snow biting into their faces. Ethan knelt immediately, checking Shadow's leg, hands careful, voice low. "I've got you," he murmured. Shadow leaned into him, trembling slightly, breath quick but controlled. From the doorway of the diner, Marcus watched, the pale lights framing his grin. As Ethan and Shadow drove back toward the cabin through the growing storm, the silence between them felt different now. He had hoped to remain invisible here, to pass through White Hollow without disturbing its fragile balance. But balance, he realized, was a lie when fear was the foundation. Night settled over the mountains like a closing fist. At the edge of town, the same pickup from the fuel station rolled past them slowly before turning away. Ethan reached the cabin, helped Shadow inside, and sat with him on the floor long after the heater finally began to warm the room. The storm howled beyond the walls, wind pressing against the windows as if the mountain itself were trying to speak. Ethan knew one thing with clarity that would not leave him. White Hollow was no longer just a place he was passing through. It had chosen him. The storm arrived without ceremony. One moment the sky above White Hollow was a dull, overcast gray, and the next it collapsed into wind and snow so thick the world seemed to shrink to the length of a breath. Ethan Cross had finished a late check of the cabin's outer latch and was stacking firewood near the porch when the first heavy gust tore through the clearing, bending the trees until they groaned. Winter in the mountains was not loud by accident. It was loud on purpose, as if warning anyone who believed they could survive it alone. Inside, the cabin glowed with the small, stubborn warmth of the heater. The air smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. Shadow lay near the door on his blanket, the 7-year-old German Shepherd's black and tan coat thickened by winter, his muzzle frosted with gray, his amber eyes half closed but never truly resting. The old injury in his hind leg had stiffened with the cold. Ethan had wrapped it carefully before nightfall, his hands moving with practiced patience. Shadow accepted the attention without protest, ears tilting back in that familiar, apologetic way, as though the pain were a personal failing. Ethan sat at the narrow table, mending a split seam in one of his gloves. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair still trimmed in the quiet habit of duty, his face lined with the restraint of a man who had learned to keep the world outside of himself. The storm rattled the windows. Snow scraped against the siding. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under the weight of ice. Then Shadow lifted his head. It was not the sudden alarm of an intruder. It was the slow, uncertain tension of a creature listening to something that did not belong. his ears angled forward. His chest expanded with a low, contained sound that never reached a growl. Ethan's fingers paused over the glove. He followed Shadow's gaze to the door. A moment later, the sound came. Faint at first, then closer. Footsteps in snow. Not the careless shuffle of a neighbor's boots. These were measured. Heavy. Ethan rose. Before he could reach the door, Shadow pushed past him. The German Shepherd moved faster than his injured leg should have allowed, the old loyalty burning brighter than pain. The door swung open on the storm and the night swallowed him. "Shadow," Ethan called. The wind answered. Ethan pulled on his coat and followed, boots skidding on the icy porch. The storm wrapped him in white and noise. Snow blinded the clearing. The trees bent and creaked like tired giants. He could not see the road, only the darker suggestion of it. Then, near the edge of the light spilling from the cabin, he saw a shape on the ground. Shadow lay on his side, chest heaving, his breath fogging the air in short, shallow bursts. A dark line marked the snow along his flank, the red already fading under fresh flakes. There were no men in sight, no voices, only the storm and the space where someone had been. Ethan dropped to his knees, the cold biting through his jeans. His hands found Shadow's body, warm and trembling. The dog's tail twitched once, faintly, the small, stubborn sign of trust that cut deeper than any wound. Ethan's chest tightened. He pressed his forehead briefly to Shadow's and spoke the only words that mattered. "I've got you." He lifted Shadow with careful arms. The dog was heavy, older than he used to be, the years adding weight to what had once been effortless. Snow soaked through Ethan's coat as he carried him to the truck. The wind tore at them. Somewhere beyond the clearing, an engine growled and faded, swallowed by distance and weather. The drive to the veterinary clinic was nearly an hour through mountain roads that vanished beneath ice and blowing snow. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, the other steadying Shadow's body. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the dark. The world outside those beams might as well not exist. Shadow's breathing stuttered. Ethan whispered to him, his voice low and steady, the way he once spoke to men who could not hear him anymore. The words did not matter. The sound of them did. The clinic's lights were still on. Dr. Evelyn Moore met them at the door. She was in her late 50s, average height, solidly built, with brown hair streaked silver and pulled back in a tight knot that never moved out of place. Her eyes were calm, practiced, the eyes of someone who had learned how to stand in the space between fear and function. She asked few questions, but when Ethan said the injury happened near his cabin, her gaze sharpened. She did not comment on it. She worked quickly. Stitches, bandages. The clean, efficient rhythm of a woman who understood that hesitation was its own kind of harm. When it was done, she rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He'll live," she said, "but this isn't nothing. He'll need rest. And time." Ethan nodded, relief loosening something inside his chest that he had been holding for too long. Outside, the storm had softened to a wet, steady fall. Ethan leaned against the truck and let his head drop forward. For the first time since Laura's funeral, since the service ended and the world expected him to continue as if nothing essential had been taken, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the quiet release of something that had been carried too far, too long. They returned to the cabin near dawn. The following days blurred. The storm moved on, leaving the world bright and raw beneath fresh snow. Ethan stayed close to the cabin, tending to Shadow, skipping work at the station. The German Shepherd lay on his blanket, bandages stark against his dark coat, eyes tracking Ethan's every movement. The injury had dulled him. The proud set of his shoulders sagged. When Ethan knelt beside him, Shadow pressed his head into his chest as if to apologize for being broken. Ethan's jaw set. He stroked the dog's fur with slow, careful hands. "You didn't fail," he said. "You did your job." On the third day, Ethan drove into town for supplies. The change was immediate. At the hardware store, Carl Renshaw, a stooped man in his 60s with thick glasses and hands stained by years of honest work, avoided Ethan's eyes and muttered that business was slow. At the feed supply, a clerk told him they no longer needed help unloading. At the diner, Claire hesitated before saying the manager had filled the position Ethan had asked about. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes carried an apology she did not speak. By noon, Ethan understood. Fear moved through White Hollow like smoke, and someone had lit the match. He returned to the cabin with empty hands and a heavier silence. Shadow limped to the door when he arrived, refusing to stay down. Ethan fed him carefully and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The wind rattled the trees outside. The world felt smaller than it had the day before. That night, the memories came. Not the loud ones, not the fire and chaos of the old work, the quiet decisions, the moments when restraint saved lives, and the moments when it cost them. He had sworn, after Laura's death, that he would never live by violence again. He had come to White Hollow for quiet, for something that looked like peace. But peace did not grow where fear ruled. Late in the evening, there was a knock at the door. Ethan stood slowly. He did not reach for anything except the handle. When he opened it, Claire Donovan stood on the porch, her coat dusted with snow, her blonde hair streaked with gray escaping its knot. Her face was pale in the cold. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "You're safe," Ethan replied. She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her eyes went immediately to Shadow. The dog's ears lifted at her presence. "They're talking," she said quietly. "About you, about your dog, about the night." Ethan waited. Claire's shoulders rose and fell once. "You should leave," she said. "This town needs men like you." Ethan met her gaze. "I don't run." She studied him for a long moment. Neither did the last one who tried. Ethan did not ask who. When she left, the wind followed her down the steps. Ethan closed the door and stood in the quiet, staring at the wood grain as if it held an answer. Shadow shifted on his blanket and let out a low, tired sound. Ethan knelt beside him and rested a hand on his fur, feeling warmth and life and the steady trust that had not broken even when the world had. He thought of all the times Shadow had stood between him and darkness without question. Silence had failed them. He crossed the room and opened the old footlocker at the back of the cabin. Inside lay the remains of another life. Worn gloves, faded photographs, a folded American flag. No weapons, no shortcuts. Just memory. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, an engine growled and faded. Ethan closed the footlocker and stood in the doorway, staring into the dark. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not let Shadow bleed for his restraint again. The invitation arrived the way threats always do in places that have learned how to survive on fear. Without paper, without witnesses, and without a single word spoken directly to the man it was meant for. Ethan Cross heard about it from 3 different people before sunset, each one delivering the same message with different eyes. A mechanic who closed his shop early and would not meet Ethan's gaze. A woman at the grocery store who dropped a jar of beans and did not bend to pick it up. And finally Claire Donovan, behind the counter of her diner, who stopped wiping a glass mid-motion and said only, "They're gathering at the old freight warehouse tonight." The warehouse sat beyond the rail line, a rusted spine of a building with broken windows and a roof that sagged beneath decades of neglect, abandoned when the town stopped needing honest work. Years ago, people avoided it because it reminded them of what they had lost. Now they avoided it because Marcus Hale had claimed it as his stage. By dusk, the clouds dragged low across the mountains, turning the sky the color of old steel. Snow began to fall again, thick and wet, the kind that soaked through coats and settled into bones. Ethan returned to the cabin and moved with slow precision, the way he did when the world demanded focus. He checked Shadow's bandages, adjusting them with careful hands. The 7-year-old German Shepherd was thinner now, his once thick coat dulled by pain and age, but his amber eyes remained sharp. He had healed enough to stand, though stiffness lingered in his movements. When Ethan knelt to meet his gaze, Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. "You stay close," Ethan said quietly. It was not a command, it was a promise. They walked instead of driving. Ethan wanted no noise, no attention. The dirt road crunched beneath his boots, each step measured. The wind cut across the clearing, snow stinging his cheeks. The trees leaned inward as if listening. Shadow kept pace at his side, hind legs stiff, head high, a sentry carved from loyalty. As they neared the rail line, voices drifted through the broken walls of the warehouse, laughter crude and careless, the sound of men who believed they owned the night. Temporary flood lamps had been wired to a generator, their harsh light spilling across the snow. Marcus Hale stood at the center of it all, thick through the chest and neck, his dark beard trimmed into something deliberate, hair slicked back as if confidence itself were a uniform he wore. He was early 40s, tall, heavy in his stance, chin lifted, pale eyes gleaming with the expectation of being watched. Around him stood 5 other men, none particularly dangerous alone, together leaning into cruelty for confidence. A tall, narrow man with a shaved head and nervous eyes held a length of metal pipe loosely, pretending calm he did not have. A broader man with scarred hands cracked his knuckles. A younger one hovered at the edge, trying to look braver than he felt. Marcus spotted Ethan immediately. "Well," he called, his voice carrying over the wind, "look who found his way out of the woods. I was starting to think you learned your place." Ethan stepped into the light and stopped. Snow settled on his shoulders, dark hair, the collar of his coat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built with the quiet economy of someone who had learned that strength was not something to display. His face was still, his eyes reserved. Shadow moved ahead of him instinctively, placing his body between Ethan and the others. A low growl rolled from the dog's chest, restrained but unmistakable. Marcus's smile sharpened. "Still hiding behind the dog?" Ethan's voice was calm when he spoke. "This ends tonight." Laughter erupted. Marcus gestured lazily, and the man with the pipe stepped forward. He was tall and narrow, his breath fogging in short bursts. Before Ethan could move, the man lunged, not at Ethan, but at Shadow. The sound Shadow made when the pipe struck was not loud. It was worse than that. A raw, broken sound that cut straight through restraint. Something inside Ethan did not explode into rage. It settled into clarity. He closed the distance in 3 steps, catching the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisting just enough to break the grip without breaking bone. The pipe clattered to the concrete. Ethan redirected the man's momentum, using his weight against him, dropping him hard. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Another man rushed in, fists swinging wildly. Ethan sidestepped, blocked, and sent him to the ground with a controlled strike to the shoulder that ended the fight before it began. The third man hesitated, then advanced with a shout. Ethan's elbow caught him cleanly, knocking the wind from his lungs. He fell and did not rise. Marcus backed up a step. Shock flickered across his face. Ethan did not pursue him. He turned instead to Shadow, kneeling quickly, checking for injury. The dog trembled but stayed upright, pressing his head into Ethan's chest. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against Shadow's, grounding himself. Then he stood. The remaining men hesitated. None moved forward. Marcus's voice rose, sharp with humiliation. "You think this makes you something? You think you've won?" Ethan finally looked at him fully. His eyes were steady, unreadable. "I'm not here to win," he said. "I'm here to stop this." Marcus sneered. "You could kill me right now. That's what you people do, right?" Ethan took one step closer, then another, until he stood within arm's reach. Snow collected on Marcus's shoulders, melting into dark spots on his jacket. "I could," Ethan said simply, "but I won't." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. Marcus searched Ethan's face for doubt, for weakness, for anything he could exploit. He found none. Ethan turned away. Behind him, Marcus shouted something, an insult, a threat, but it landed hollow. The small crowd that had gathered at the edge of the warehouse did not cheer. They did not step in. They watched, faces pale, as Ethan walked out with Shadow at his side. By morning, the story had already changed. People whispered. They compared what they had seen to what they had believed. A man who could destroy Marcus had chosen not to. That detail unsettled them more than violence ever could. Ethan returned to the cabin before dawn, Shadow limping beside him, the storm easing into a quiet fall. He cleaned the dog's wound with careful hands, spoke to him in the low, steady voice that had carried men through worse. Shadow's breathing slowed. The heater rattled. The world outside the walls seemed farther away. When the sun finally rose, thin and pale over the mountains, Ethan stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the snow settle into the trees. He felt the shift, not outward, not loud, but deep beneath the surface of things, like frost beginning to crack under early light. He did not know what would come next. He only knew he had chosen. The town woke differently after the night at the warehouse. It wasn't louder, or brighter, or suddenly brave, but something beneath the surface had shifted, like ice beginning to crack under early sun. Snow still clung to rooftops, and the mountain ridges still wore their white crowns, yet the air carried a strange, cautious expectation. People lingered longer in doorways. Conversations paused when Ethan crossed past, not out of fear this time, but recognition. What they had seen could not be unseen. Ethan felt it everywhere. At the grocery store, the clerk, an elderly woman with careful hands and iron-gray hair, rang up his items and quietly slid a small bag of dog treats across the counter without charging him. At the gas station, a man Ethan barely knew nodded once, firmly, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. Even Claire Donovan behind the diner counter moved with a new steadiness when Ethan came in for coffee, her shoulders no longer hunched, as though bracing for impact. Claire was tall and slender, her sun-worn skin catching the morning light, blonde hair streaked with gray pulled back in a low knot. Years of raising her son alone after her husband's mining death had shaped her into someone who understood how silence could be both shield and prison. Watching Ethan walk away from Marcus, choosing restraint when he could have chosen ruin, had reopened something she thought she had buried. Shadow's recovery set the rhythm of Ethan's days. The 7-year-old German shepherd lay on the cabin's rug near the heater, bandages stark against his black and tan coat. His breathing was steady now, but the old injury in his hind leg had deepened into stiffness. Mornings were the hardest. Ethan knelt and worked the joint gently, fingers moving with patient precision. Shadow would lean his head into Ethan's chest, apologetic as always, then rise on trembling legs and follow him outside to watch the snow fall from the trees. The world beyond the cabin felt closer than it had a week ago, as if the mountains themselves were listening. It began with small things. An anonymous envelope appeared beneath the door of the sheriff's office. Receipts, dates, amounts, names written in uneven ink. A burner phone was left on the steps of Town Hall, filled with recordings of threats and payments. Carl Renshaw, the stooped hardware store owner with thick glasses and hands stained by decades of honest work, finally walked in and spoke, his voice trembling until it steadied. Then another, and another. Fear had trained them well, but truth, once loosened, moved faster. Sheriff Nolan Pierce, broad-shouldered and worn by years of compromise, listened without interruption. The gray mustache he had worn for decades twitched with something close to resolve. He had once believed keeping the peace meant not pushing too hard. But the night he heard what happened at the warehouse, and who had walked away when he could have destroyed, something old and buried stirred inside him. Nolan picked up the phone and called the state. By the time the first cruiser arrived from outside the county, the town was already buzzing. State investigators moved quietly, efficiently, the kind of calm that comes from knowing how to stand in the middle of a storm. Among them was Special Agent Laura Hayes, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was average height, athletic, with the controlled presence of someone accustomed to chaos. She spoke politely, but her questions cut straight through evasions. Ethan was not their source. He did not volunteer information. When Agent Hayes came to the cabin, she found him repairing a fence post while Shadow lay nearby. The bandages were gone now, movement still careful but improving. Shadow's coat had regained some shine, though age and injury had slowed him. He watched the agents closely, calm but alert, tail resting against the floorboards. "We're not here for you," Hayes said after a moment, observing Ethan's measured silence. "But your name keeps coming up." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "I didn't ask for that." "No," she replied. "You didn't." Marcus Hale unraveled. He did not return to the diner. He did not cruise the streets in his truck or laugh too loudly at nothing. Instead, he holed up in his rented house at the edge of town, blinds drawn, presence shrinking. Men who once followed him now avoided his name. Fear had sustained Marcus's power, and fear was changing shape. 2 days later, the town gathered, not to cheer, but to witness. Marcus emerged unshaven, eyes darting, jacket hanging loose on shoulders that suddenly seemed smaller. His beard was uneven now, confidence replaced by something sharp and frantic. As cuffs clicked into place, he searched faces for allies and found none. When his eyes landed on Ethan, standing quietly across the street with Shadow at his side, something like disbelief crossed his face. Ethan did not look back. He was watching Shadow, his hand resting lightly on the dog's neck. The charges came quickly: extortion, assault, intimidation, illegal operations tied to surrounding counties. Each accusation was built not by one hero, but by many quiet people finally speaking at once. In the weeks that followed, the town exhaled. It wasn't a celebration, healing never was, but doors unlocked earlier. Children rode bikes again without being called inside. At the diner, laughter returned. Not the brittle kind that filled space, but the gentle sound of relief. Shadow recovered steadily. His limp faded to a stiffness that eased with time and care. He took to lying on the porch in the afternoons, head lifted, watching the road. Children passed and waved. Shadow wagged his tail once, dignified, accepting their presence as if guarding something precious. Ethan noticed the way people looked at him now, not with expectation, but gratitude. It made him uncomfortable. He hadn't come back to be seen. He had come back to disappear. One evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, Ethan sat on the porch beside Shadow, the cabin behind them warm for once. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Ethan rested his hand on Shadow's back, feeling steady breath under his palm. He thought about everything he hadn't done. He hadn't struck Marcus when it would have been easy. He hadn't taken revenge when it would have felt justified. He hadn't spoken louder than necessary. For the first time since the service, Ethan felt something close to peace. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of choice. The town would never be perfect. Neither would he. But the truth had surfaced, and it had held. For now, that was enough. Spring came to White Hollow the way all important things do in the mountains. Quietly, cautiously, as if unsure it was welcome. Snow retreated from the shaded edges of the road first, then from the fields, leaving behind damp earth that smelled of renewal. The town followed suit, not with banners or speeches, but with small, careful changes that added up to something real. Ethan Cross stayed. He could have left once Marcus Hale was gone. More than one person expected him to. Men like Ethan, they believed, didn't settle. They passed through, fixed what was broken, then disappeared. But Ethan repaired the cabin roof instead of packing. He replaced the rotting boards along the porch and cleared the brush from the path. He moved with the same patient precision he brought to everything now, measuring twice. Acting once, while Shadow supervised from the doorway. Shadow was slower these days. The 7-year-old German shepherd's steps were measured, the old stiffness lingering in his hind leg when mornings were cold. His coat had regained its shine, black and tan, catching the sun when he lay in the grass near the porch. His muzzle was whiter now, and his ears didn't snap upright as quickly as they once had. Yet his presence carried authority. People noticed how he watched the road, calm and alert, tail resting against the wood. Children passed and waved. Shadow acknowledged them with a dignified thump of his tail, accepting their greetings like a guard who knew his watch mattered. Work returned to Ethan's life in a different shape. It began one afternoon when a middle-aged woman knocked on his door with a trembling young hound wrapped in a blanket. She had tired eyes and hands, roughened by years of labor, and she apologized for showing up unannounced. Ethan didn't ask questions. He knelt, examined the dog carefully, and offered help. Word traveled. Soon he was fixing fences and training dogs, teaching patience more than commands. He showed owners how to listen, how to earn trust instead of demanding obedience. He didn't charge much. Sometimes he didn't charge at all. Shadow often sat nearby, living proof that loyalty was built over time, not forced. Claire Donovan came by one afternoon with coffee and a pie she insisted was extra and not up for debate. She looked lighter somehow, shoulders less tense, laughter easier to find. Her blonde hair, streaked with gray, caught the sun when she stepped onto the porch, and her skin held the warm bronze of someone who had spent years under open skies. "You look settled," she said, setting the pie down. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the word but not disagreeing. Claire watched Shadow stretch and settle again. "Town's different," she added. "Quieter, kinder." Ethan nodded. He felt it too. Not perfect, never perfect, but honest. The diner had changed as well. Without Marcus's shadow, it became a place people returned to for warmth rather than refuge. Claire ran it with a firmer hand now, unafraid to say no, unafraid to ask for help when she needed it. She had lost her husband years earlier and learned resilience in a different way than Ethan had, and something in their shared understanding needed no explanation. One evening, Sheriff Nolan Pierce stopped by the cabin. He had shed his uniform jacket, wearing a simple coat instead, his weathered face lined with something close to relief. Retirement loomed now, less as an escape and more as a handover to a town finally willing to stand for itself. "Didn't come to ask you for anything," Nolan said, glancing at Shadow. "Just wanted to say thank you." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do much." Nolan smiled faintly. "You did enough." After he left, Ethan sat with Shadow on the porch as twilight settled in. Crickets began their steady rhythm. The mountain stood quiet and patient, watching as they always had. Ethan thought about the man he'd been when he returned. Closed off, carrying too much weight, convinced peace meant isolation. He thought about the choices he'd made instead of the ones he'd avoided. About the violence he'd stopped not with force but with restraint. About the way Shadow had stood by him through every moment, asking nothing but honesty. Ethan rested his hand on Shadow's back. The dog leaned into it, content. "I think we're okay," Ethan murmured. Shadow's tail thumped once in agreement. As the weeks passed, the cabin became more than shelter. It became a gathering place. A neighbor dropped off leftover lumber. Another brought seedlings for the small garden Ethan had started behind the house. Children came with questions about their dogs, about training, about life. Ethan answered when he could. When he couldn't, he listened. He slept better too. The dreams faded, not all at once, but enough. Nights grew quieter inside his head. When memories surfaced, they no longer dragged him under. They reminded him how far he'd come. One late afternoon, Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Shadow greet a pair of rescued dogs whose owners had brought them for training. Shadow moved carefully, patiently, tail low but welcoming. The dogs responded in kind, learning without fear. Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Simple, steady, warm. He didn't need a grand house. He didn't need recognition or applause. He didn't need to win. He had a home that asked nothing more than care. A town learning how to stand together. And a dog who had chosen him again and again through every quiet and every storm. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan closed the gate and walked back toward the cabin, Shadow at his side. For the first time in many years, Ethan Cross slept through the night. No alarms, no ghosts, just the sound of wind in the trees and a faithful heartbeat nearby, guarding the peace they had earned. Sometimes miracles do not arrive wrapped in light. Sometimes they come wrapped in silence. A broken man, an aging dog, a small town that had forgotten how to stand. Ethan did not win by destroying his enemy. He won by refusing to become one. And Shadow did not save anyone with teeth or force. He saved a soul by staying, by trusting, by loving without condition. The last winter of fear had passed. This story reminds us that God does not always send miracles with thunder and light. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through a broken man who chooses kindness, through a wounded dog who refuses to leave, through a town that learns to stand again. In our daily lives, we all face moments when silence feels safer than courage, when walking away feels easier than standing for what is right. But this story shows us that when we protect what is good instead of striking back, God is already working in ways we cannot see. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and healing. May God bless you, protect you, and walk with you through every storm. If you believe that quiet miracles still happen, type Amen in the comments below.